we want to get to.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good afternoon. We're coming on the air with breaking news. Former President Trump has been indicted in the special counsel's investigation with 4 new charges filed for efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election. This marks the first time a former president has been charged in connection to disrupting the transfer of power between administrations. Today's indictment also comes just days after that same special counsel, Jack Smith, filed superseding charges against the former president in a separate case related to his handling of classified documents after leaving office. Mr. Trump also faces separate criminal charges for a 3rd case in New York State, where earlier this year he pled not guilty to charges involving hush money payments during his 2016 campaign. But today's new charges could be among the most significant. Legal challenges Mr. Trump is facing, and a reminder he has denied any wrongdoing in all these cases. Let's bring in our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. You literally just received the indictment. You've had a chance to go through it. 4 charges. Can you tell us what they are?
Yes, Lester. This really focuses on all of the efforts that the former president undertook to try to overturn the will of the people, to overturn the election results. It is not, at least as on this first reading, about the violence that took place at the Capitol. As you can see there on your screen, obstruction-related charges, specifically obstructing the congressional vote count that happened on January 6th, and all of the steps that the former president and his allies took to try to stop that count, to try to stop the peaceful transition of power. So we're going to go through this. It is lengthy, spanning about 45 pages, but again, the former president of the United States, for the first time in history, has been indicted for trying to thwart the last election.
And to frame this from the beginning, this was never necessarily about the riot itself of January 6th, but what the prosecutors believe may have sparked that riot.
Well, and we had wondered for some time exactly what the charges would be, as everyone remembers those iconic images from the attack on the Capitol and the speech that he made preceding it. And we had wondered whether he would be charged with some sort of incitement-related crime. And we're going to need to go through it again. But on the first pass, this appears to relate to the actual steps that he tried to take to thwart the vote count. Right. So that's why we're going to, again, try to
I'll give you a moment to go through that. Let me bring in NBC's Garrett Haake, who has been covering the former president. Garrett, walk us through how this day has gone.
Well, Lester, this is a day that the Trump campaign has long anticipated would happen. It was always a question of when, not if, in their minds, that he would face additional charges related to the 2020 campaign. And as has been the case in his previous indictments, the former president tried to scoop the announcement using his social media platform to post earlier today that he suspected this would come Friday, and to start questioning the timing of this indictment as a form of election interference, arguing that where it comes in the presidential campaign could only be an effort by President Biden to somehow derail his campaign. Since word of the indictment has broken, a former president's spokesman confirms to me that he was informed of the fact that he had been indicted, and the campaign sent out a lengthy statement using much the same language that they've used in the face of his other legal challenges over the years, calling this an un-American witch hunt, suggesting that it is purely political, even making hyperbolic comparisons to 1930s Nazi Germany and Soviet authoritarianism to describe the kinds of conduct here from the Justice Department going after the former president. So it's clear that he's going to fight this in the public sphere just as much as he fights it in a courtroom. That has already become such a key part of his presidential campaign, Lester. In fact, the former president's previous arraignments, particularly the New York arraignment, have been huge days for him from an online fundraising capacity. Things like this, which would have been badly damaging right away to other presidential candidates, haven't seemed to have the same effect. The former president will be making this, I think, a key part of his campaign going forward as he fights these charges in the legal system.
All right, Garrett, we'll ask you to stand by. Let me bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson. And Hallie, Garrett just walked us through some of the things the former president has said, trying to liken this to election interference in the 2024 election. Remind us again how this investigation began and the timing. It was before Mr. Trump was a presidential candidate.
That's right, as far as the special counsel investigation, and then the special counsel, the investigation itself, and then the special counsel, of course, was created after Donald Trump did become a presidential candidate this cycle. I want to hit on a couple of key points, Lester, that we are learning from this indictment. First, the next big date, this indictment says that the former president has been summoned to appear on August 3rd, which is Thursday. So Thursday will be the day, based on this indictment, that we may see the former president. I'll leave it to the legal experts to talk through whether or not that date could change based on conversations with the former president's attorneys here. I would also note, and I think it's, big picture, right, remind people what this is based on, right? At the core of this indictment appears to be the former president's insistence that this election, the 2020 election, was stolen from him. It was not. That was not true, and this indictment lays out a series of examples related to the former president's mindset. The prosecutors here are saying Donald Trump knew that wasn't true. He knew it wasn't true when he persisted in making these claims that were not founded of election fraud. He'd been told directly, they say he'd been informed directly that this was not the case, and yet he continued to make those claims through the election, after the election, before January 6th, after the January 6th. In fact, and this is not in the indictment, this is sort of me just telling you based on the reporting here, Donald Trump continues to make those claims even today, that the 2020 election was stolen from him illegally. Again, it was not. There is no evidence of widespread fraud in the 2020 election. And I think it is interesting, as we're looking through this indictment, that it very specifically lays out his mindset. Remember, his attorney general, even at the time, Bill Barr, came out publicly and said there was no evidence of widespread fraud. This indictment lays out multiple instances where the former president, people around him, were told that it was not the case, Lester. And I think that mindset question has been an important one and continues to be an important one.
All right, Pally, I'll ask you to stand by as well. NBC News Chief White House correspondent Kristen Welker joins me now. Kristen, we have seen everything leading up to this point. In fact, Mr. Trump himself has predicted this moment would happen. But to the extent that he's campaigning off it and seems to be enjoying his rise in the polls, the reality is these are very, very, very serious charges going forward.
You're absolutely right, Lester. These are very serious charges. Politically speaking, we have seen former President Trump really benefit from these indictments in the polls. And in terms of a spike in his fundraising, Lester, he's 37 points ahead of Ron DeSantis, his nearest GOP challenger. However, from a financial standpoint, if you take a look at what he's spent so far in 2023, he's outspent how much he has raised, his super PAC has, in legal fees. So that speaks to the fact that this is starting to chip away at his overall operation as he runs for re-election. But again, politically speaking, we have seen his polls increase. We've seen a spike in fundraising. That's the primary. What happens in the general election? That's another matter. We've gotten recent polling out just this week, Lester, that show that he is running neck and neck with President Biden. No surprise there. This is a deeply divided country. We expect whatever the ultimate general election race to be a close one, so it's not a surprise that you would see President Biden and former President Trump running neck and neck. But it does raise questions about what this could mean if, in fact, he is the Republican nominee. So at this point in time, we're seeing both sides of that. We're also watching in terms of the questions that remain to see how his Republican challengers respond to this, Lester. So far, you have a few of them. Chris Christie, Will Hurd, Asa Hutchinson really sharpening their attacks against the former president, saying that, look, these mounting legal troubles make him a weak candidate in a general election. But so far, you're not seeing a chorus of voices. Ron DeSantis walking a very fine line, for example. Will that start to change in the upcoming debate now just a few weeks away? We'll have to see, Lester.
All right, Kristen, thank you. Let me bring in former U.S. Attorney and senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg. Chuck, for there to be a conspiracy, there have to be other individuals. We don't know who those are.
Well, we don't know their names. At least they're not named in the indictment. But there's traditional charging language that prosecutors use in a conspiracy, Lester, citing to conspirators known and unknown to the grand jury. And then they list 6 known conspirators, not by name, but by description. 5 of them are attorneys. One of the 5 attorneys is a Department of Justice official. And then the 6th known conspirator, again, not named, is a political consultant. So there are others that are clearly on the radar of Jack Smith and his team, others who joined in a criminal conspiracy with Mr. Trump. So we'll certainly learn their names. The prosecutors, of course, know their names, but they are identified specifically in the indictment by the jobs they hold, the positions they held during the course of the conspiracy. Another point to make, charging a conspiracy in a speaking indictment, as the Smith team did, gives us a tremendous amount of detail about the indictment and the allegations. So in that way, very similar, Lester, to the indictment that was returned and then superseded in the Southern District of Florida. Speaking indictments with tremendous detail. I hope people read it carefully.
These 4 charges we're looking at here now, how will they be defended? How would they typically be defended? Do you see any obvious weaknesses in the government's charges?
Well, I don't see weaknesses in the government's charges because I haven't had a chance yet to read the indictment carefully. But assuming that the government can adduce and prove in court everything it alleges in the indictment, my quick look at the indictment suggests that it's compelling and strong. That said, how do you defend against a case like this? So to your question, Lester, traditionally, typically, in these sorts of cases, the defendant will argue that he didn't have the requisite intent to commit these crimes. He may argue that he relied upon attorneys for their advice and counsel, and by doing so, he should be absolved of any criminal liability. Simply put, the government always has to prove intent, and often in these types of cases, a defendant will claim that he lacked the requisite intent. But, and this is important, there are numerous individuals also cited in this indictment who did the right thing by telling Mr. Trump that he lost the election. They are also listed in the indictment by position: the Vice President of the United States, Department of Justice officials, the Director of National Intelligence, Department of Homeland Security officials, and officials from the White House counsel's office, Mr. Trump's internal counsels within the office of president. And so with all of those people telling Mr. Trump he lost and being designated in the indictment as having done that, it becomes that much more difficult for Mr. Trump to claim he lacked the requisite intent. So that's how these cases are often sort of framed for battle: government proving intent, a defendant arguing he didn't form the requisite intent. But it seems here that the government, Mr. Smith and his team of prosecutors and agents, have thought carefully about that already.
All right, Chuck Rosenberg, thank you. Let me go to our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. I bought you as much time as I could to read through this document. What stands out to you?
A couple of interesting things. The story that the prosecutors are telling here is incredibly detailed, and we're still working our way through it. But to Chuck's point, talking about the former president's intent, on page 7, they lay out all of the times, and these probably aren't all of that they've collected, but they give some examples of the times that the former president was told that the things that he was saying publicly were flat out false. And the reason that they're doing that is because they need to show that he was acting with some sort of corrupt mindset. And they don't have to show that he was told directly that you're breaking the law, but the fact that they have on several different occasions here, people telling him there was no evidence of widespread fraud, people telling him that the vice president didn't single-handedly have the power to overturn the will of the people, does bolster their case. And it's interesting, they specifically say the defendant had a right, like every American, to publicly speak about the election. This is on page 3. He was also entitled to formally challenge the results through lawful and appropriate means. What he was not allowed to do was to try to actually use improper means to overturn the election results. And the best example is, imagine for a moment that you think a bank has taken your money. You notice a strange withdrawal on your bank account, and you think that wasn't right. The right way to challenge that is to actually go through a process. The right way to challenge that is not to rob the bank. And that's essentially what they've indicted him for here, was to use improper means. Even if he thought that he was the right elector, even if he thought that he had actually somehow won the election despite all of the evidence to the contrary, what prosecutors are saying here is you actually have to challenge it through the appropriate court process, and that is not what he did in this case.
Let's bring in your co-reader here, Danny Savalas, an NBC News legal analyst. What stands out to you? What have you been able to learn from this?
For me, thinking about a potential defense of Trump has always revolved around how can he claim ignorance and how will DOJ address this in the indictment, and they do. Because the key is, if Trump opposed this election the way he did, what if he believed that his claims were true? And the indictment addresses that. It addresses that Trump had knowledge, or at least reason to know, that his claims were false. And they list that right on page 7. They list all the different people and entities that told him, essentially, Mr. President, you are wrong. And that includes the vice president, senior leaders of the Justice Department. You have the director of national intelligence. You have the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. All of these people are combining to tell the president that there's no there there. There is no fraud. You're wrong. And so in light of all of these people telling him that and him proceeding, that allows an inference that the president at the time knew what he was doing was wrong, knew that he did not have a valid claim that the election was stolen. And so for me, that has always been the key, that if they charge him with any of these crimes, whether it's conspiracy to defraud the United States or conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, much of his defense would revolve around the claim that I believed that what I was doing was right. Yes, there were courts that were saying, that were dismissing my claims. Yes, the liberal media, for example, was saying that I was wrong, but I believed it, and I had enough people around me telling me that it was reasonable for me to think so. That's the core of his defense. I mean, the only other real defense is getting elected and appointing an attorney general to get rid of these charges. But the key here is, how do you address Trump's knowledge? It's always been the key, and now we see in this indictment they're addressing it.
But did not, correct me if I'm wrong, did not evidence come out during the January 6 hearings that there were those who heard him acknowledge that he knew he'd lost?
Yes, exactly. So that is going to be part of this, the government's burden of proof here. It may be somewhere in these words, but Laura and I and everybody else were furiously going through it. But they feature prominently right up front. They list all the different agencies and entities and people. And I always suspected that that would feature prominently in any indictment. The fact that senior members of the DOJ told him, you're wrong, including his outgoing attorney general, who sat him down and said, these claims, there's nothing there. And I knew also, I suspected rather, that they would, that the indictment would also have a lot on the fact that Donald Trump attempted to subvert, allegedly, the DOJ to achieve his election goals. Beyond being just morally culpable, you're going to have a lot of witnesses who are senior DOJ members, people who oppose this, and people who are going to be credible. Credible in a way that co-conspirators or cooperating witnesses ordinarily aren't. These are going to be very credible witnesses, and for the most part, we've already heard their story through the January 6th committee testimony and hearings from last summer. So we all knew most of the operative facts. The government is now saying those operative facts make out specific cases: conspiracy to defraud, obstruction of official proceeding. There you have it. We may have already known what happened. Now we know how the government sees that, and they see it as a crime.
All right, and then I should point out to folks, this is a pretty lengthy document you're all going through, so we appreciate you going through it and pulling out the salient facts. I also want to let folks know that we're now expecting to hear from Jack Smith in a briefing or a statement coming up perhaps within the next 10 minutes or so. We'll keep you up to date on that. Let me bring in former federal prosecutor and NBC News legal analyst Carol Lamb. Carol, a lot to go through. I don't know what you've been able to read. One of the issues I know going into this was whether they would focus on the so-called fake electors. Do we know if that's included in here?
That is actually the bulk of what is included in here, Lester. And I think what people are going to wonder is, gee, you know, after everything we heard in the January 6th congressional hearing, how come we don't see charges relating to the actual violent breach of the Capitol that day? Isn't that so much of what the investigation in Congress took place with? And I think this was a very, very deliberate and smart decision on Jack Smith's part. He decided, I'm going to focus on the case that is easily, readily provable, and I'm not going to get involved in this brawl that took place on the grounds of the Capitol that day, because that is a trial that could take a long time, and at the end of the day, I don't know if I can get a conviction of Donald Trump on that. And remember, Donald Trump is now looking at 3 and possibly 4 criminal trials within the next year if they're all going to get done before the election. Jack Smith cannot afford to have a trial that goes on for 8 months. He needs to be surgical. He needs to get this conviction quickly. And it's rather unusual to have a conspiracy indictment brought where so many of the conspirators are not charged. They are unindicted conspirators described in the indictment. Only one individual is named in this indictment as a defendant, and that is Donald Trump. And that is likely because Jack Smith is trying to keep this case confined so that it can be tried quickly and he doesn't have to deal with multi-defendant cases.
All right, Carol, thank you. Well, let me bring back Chuck Rosenberg. Chuck, you had some thoughts about intent, which will loom large in this case.
Yeah, we spoke about it a few moments ago. Lester and Laura and Danny also highlighted how the government has to prove intent, and Mr. Trump will try and argue that he never formed the requisite intent. But here's a box that Mr. Trump is in strategically. The best way for him to articulate his lack of intent would be for him to get on the stand and say he didn't intend for any of this thing to happen. Right? He might be able to do it through proxies. He could always try, but he runs into evidentiary problems unless he gets on the stand and says so himself. And that really is a box for Mr. Trump. As we know, he has made a lot of statements, many of them contradictory, many of them false. A good prosecutor starts on day one of the investigation putting together what we call a cross-examination file. I can only imagine how voluminous the cross-examination file that the prosecutors hold right now must be. So if Mr. Trump wants to argue, as we discussed earlier, that he lacked the requisite intent to commit these crimes, Lester, he's going to really have to consider taking the stand. Not something he's required to do, but something he might be inclined to do. And I would imagine prosecutors are salivating at the opportunity to cross-examine him.
All right, Chuck, let me bring in NBC's Garrett Hake again. A reminder, any minute we're expected to hear from Jack Smith, the special counsel in this investigation. What more can you tell us, Garrett?
Well, Lester, the political fallout from this momentous indictment is already happening, much as we expected it would. Donald Trump's Republican allies, particularly in the United States House, have been blasting out statements in his defense, many of which were crafted weeks ago in anticipation of this moment. And the former president is trying to capture the anger of his base to help his campaign fundraising. He sent out a campaign fundraising appeal via email just a few minutes after this indictment became public, which talks all about the idea that somehow prosecutors are coming after him to get to his supporters. He makes the case that he needs their support to continue defending them, and argues, as our legal team has been so thoroughly debunking, that this is all about the violence on January 6th, specifically in that fundraising email, saying he did nothing wrong on the 6th, that he told people to assemble peacefully, and that that's why he's being indicted. Obviously, the text of this indictment proves that very much not to be the case, but these fundraising appeals have been very successful for the former president up until now. His single best fundraising week was around his first indictment in New York. The single best day of that week, which he raised several $1 million in online fundraising, was on the day of his arraignment. And so using his supporters' anger at the idea, as he says, he's being targeted with so-called election interference to raise money has been a successful part of his campaign, and increasingly a necessary one. The legal bills for he and his allies, for their defense, for, just even having someone to have an attorney go with them in to give a deposition has become enormously expensive. His PAC, his primary political group outside of his campaign, spent more than $20 million in the first half of this year alone on exactly those kind of expenses. And so you see the wheels turning here, where the legal problems for Donald Trump become fuel for the political movement. That has sustained him through the first half of his campaign and put him in the position he now finds himself in, with a very healthy lead, but a significant amount of political baggage, which will run headlong into the election calendar in the early part of next year, Lester.
Yeah, I want to pick up an election calendar with Danny, if I can. The argument from former President Trump and his allies is this is all political. It's timed against his run for president. And the question is asked, and he asked it earlier in one of his posts, why now? Why not 2.5 years ago? I think people are watching now 4 indictments against the former president and wondering, why is it all happening at once?
It's a fair argument. I mean, it's a fair point to make that these facts occurred 2.5 years ago. Now, we're not outside the federal statute of limitations, generally 5 years for most crimes. But it's fair to claim that, look, this investigation has been going on for a long time. But the reality is this. Federal investigations often take a very long time. There's been at least, 2.5 years. And yes, there's been investigations by the January 6th committee. Yes, this has taken a long time. Defendants, as a defense attorney, they often complain about that kind of thing, but it is brought within the statute of limitations, and federal investigators, especially in this case, probably didn't want to even dream of indicting the former president, the most important criminal defendant in American history, until they knew they had everything lined up. And I just want to point one other thing out, Lester, which is really amazing when you think about it. We've all been following Fulton County, Georgia, for many years as well. Right here in this indictment, there's an entire section on the several states that submitted false electors. One of those states, of course, is Georgia. So you have almost a blueprint for charges arising out of the conduct in Georgia. So it would be surprising if there is not now this subtle pressure directed towards Fulton County, Georgia. Look, you've got a lot of allegations right here in a federal complaint that the federal government believes they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. So what are you going to do now, Fulton County, Georgia?
All right. Laura, Jared, continuing to go through this, and I'm watching the right side of the screen where we expect to see Jack Smith any moment. And Laura, as he prepares to come out there, to what extent can he prosecute in a vacuum, as if there's no such thing as a presidential campaign that's sneaking up and a primary campaign in the middle of this? Will that be his aim?
I don't know that it will be his aim. He's obviously, aware of the reality of the campaign time schedule, as everybody is. And he's also aware that already the former president has tried, in the other case brought by Jack Smith, to delay as much as possible. The argument he made is that this whole thing should be off the table completely as it relates to the documents case. He tried to argue that should just not even happen before the election. The judge didn't go for it. So, of course, I think Smith is human. He understands that the fact of the matter is that this is the front runner of the Republican Party who's running. And so perhaps it's unusual to see a case where the top person is actually the indictment you see first. And clearly there are more people that they believe to be involved in this conspiracy. So it is interesting that he brought the one against the former president of the United States first. But perhaps that's a recognition of the calendar here, and that he felt compelled to bring this case now and try at least as hard as he can to get it on the calendar, to go to trial.
So what does the trial calendar then look for? Will they go in the order of indictments? In other words, will the documents case come before this, or is it possible they think this is the low-hanging fruit?
Not necessarily. So the documents case in Florida, that's a federal case, and it's currently set for May, but we know just last week they added a new defendant, which means new security clearances, more discovery. So even though that one is set for May, it's not clear that that's going to hold. So it could be the case that this case out of D.C. that has just happened today might actually go before the documents case, even though the documents case was filed first. This one, in many ways, is sprawling. It's complicated. There's a lot to unpack here, but the classified documents has another angle, which may mean that this one goes first, even though it wasn't filed first.
And Danny, what are your thoughts that, based on what we've read so far, that this is not really getting into the heart of the riot? And we've seen, over 1,000 people charged with relation to the January 6th violence. Is that even mentioned in here?
Again, it may be, but Laura and I have still not gotten to the very end. But no, it's not charged per se, and that doesn't surprise me. Here's why. I always believed that if you're going to try to charge Donald Trump in connection with the speech that he gave on the January 6th and connecting that to rioters actually storming the Capitol, I rather thought that would not appear in this indictment. I thought that would be the toughest thing for federal prosecutors to prove, even though they have proven many cases against the actual people who stormed the Capitol. At the same time, there would be so many First Amendment implications there. There's a substantial body of Supreme Court case law on the First Amendment and giving a speech, and whether or not you create this immediate danger or that you're inciting a riot. And I think that even if prosecutors looked at that possibility, they probably thought, look, we need to prove the cases, or we need to allege only the cases, the counts that we believe we can prove absolutely and without question. We don't want to take any risks. This kind of prosecution against somebody, for example, giving a speech and that speech resulting in a riot, that would be a difficult case given all the potential First Amendment defenses. So I rather think that the government, their approach here is they're going for simplicity. They're going for the case they believe they can prove the easiest, but still vindicate the federal interests that they see in this indictment. So it does not surprise me that there are no counts related to the theory that the speech that Donald Trump gave led to the riot, led to the storming of the Capitol.
All right, let me bring Hallie back into the conversation. Hallie, we see on the right side of the screen the podium where Jack Smith should be appearing shortly. Can you talk about the task that he has right now? Again, mindful of a political calendar, but also mindful of trying to have a fair prosecution. Well,
he's got to explain to people, first of all, why are they indicting former President Trump? Because there is a sizable portion of the country, the 30% or so of people who say that they back Donald Trump, 80% of Republicans, 70, 80% who do not believe he did anything serious. He has to explain to Americans what the issue at hand is. He's also got to do something else, and how he does it, I think we've seen, and we'll see tonight. He's got to push back, or the Attorney General does in some way, perhaps, on this perception from Republicans that the Department of Justice has been weaponized against the former president. This ties into the conversation that you are having there with our folks on set here, because we are already seeing it, not just from Donald Trump's allies on Capitol Hill, as Garrett Haake has laid out, but also from the people who are running against him in the Republican primary, who are hoping to dethrone him from sort of king of the Republican Party, this perch where he sits now. Ron DeSantis, for example, in this new statement says that he thinks, he says, I haven't read the indictment, so he's leaving himself some wiggle room there. And again, this is somebody who is currently sitting at second place, well behind former President Trump in recent polling. But he does say that he thinks that we need to put in place reforms so people have the right to remove cases from D.C. to their home districts. He's essentially suggesting, he says, D.C. is, in his words, a swamp. He's suggesting that Donald Trump is not going to get a fair shake with a trial here in Washington. This may be one way that you see other Republican rivals of the former president seek to appear as though they have his back as it relates to the political persecution angle that Donald Trump has long claimed, while at the same time holding off, at least for now, on the actual substance of the indictment here. There are others who are competing in this sort of anti-Donald Trump lane in the Republican primary. I'm thinking of former Congressman Will Hurd, who are pretty directly going after Donald Trump, with Hurd saying that his presidential push is driven by an attempt to stay out of prison, and he says scam his supporters into footing his legal bills. We've talked already about the amount of money that Donald Trump's leadership PAC is spending on legal bills, something like more than $20 million paid out to 40 law firms so far in the first half of 2023. That number, one would assume, is going to continue to go up as these myriad of legal issues that the former president is facing continue to build. Lester.
All right, thanks. Let me bring in, as we wait for Jack Smith, bring in our senior White House correspondent, Kelly O'Donnell. Kelly, your observations as to we're reaching this point now.
Well, certainly we have reached out to the White House, the Biden White House, and they are pointing us to the Department of Justice, saying that they run their criminal investigations independently there. So don't anticipate any statement from the Biden White House. President Biden right now and the First Lady are out to dinner in Rehoboth Beach. They're taking some vacation days. And so a real difference in the posture right now. A president who is on the job, in office, and at the same time taking a little vacation time at a point when he has been the subject of so much critical comments from the political right, especially after the House Oversight Committee was looking into his son's business dealings. And there are some on the conservative right who say that there is no coincidence in their assessment of scrutiny of the Biden family and another action against Donald Trump. When you look at the indictment, we've so often shorthanded this as January 6th. As I look at it, the conduct goes back to November 13th as some of the earliest points when the prosecutors have identified actions taken by former President Trump and some of the unnamed co-conspirators in trying to put together their attempts to overturn the election. So it is a span of time from mid-November through to the morning of January 7th, when, of course, the election was ultimately certified. So we will be pressing the White House on opportunities to hear from the president, perhaps when he leaves from the restaurant this evening with the White House press pool that is traveling with him. But don't expect much comment as they want to have as much distance from these actions as possible. Lester.
All right, Kelly, thank you for that. Again, waiting for Jack Smith to appear at the podium to give a statement about this latest indictment filed against the former president. Let me bring in NBC's Garrett Hake again. Garrett, this has really been a lot about messaging, and the former president has tried to stay ahead and preempt bad news. And once again, he seemed to get ahead of it today. The special counsel, on the other hand, seems to be maintaining a relative silence. This is a rare opportunity to hear from him.
Yeah. That's right, Lester. And look, I mean, the Justice Department is held back in a way by their own rules. They don't speak about ongoing investigations. They don't speak about individuals who aren't indicted. They don't speak in general except in filings and in courtrooms. And those are not rules by which former President Trump is bound or has ever been bound. He has decided, really from even before he launched his presidential campaign, to wage his legal fights very much in the political realm. In fact, it's the reason why some people, including Will Hurd, the Republican candidate who Hallie just mentioned, think he is running for president to use his candidacy as a kind of political heat shield to prevent some of these charges from getting much closer to him. And by getting out in front of prosecutors, he's managed to define these debates around each of these issues, probably most successfully in New York, where he got ahead of that indictment by about 2 weeks and was able to kind of rally Republicans to his side, basically forcing them to choose. Are you with me or are you with these liberal prosecutors for a big city in Manhattan?
In just a few moments, I expect
hold on a second, Garrett.
Jack Smith come to this podium and make a statement of about 2 minutes in length. He will not take questions. If you have any questions after the press conference is over, please see me on the side. Any questions right now?
Okay, that's an aide for Jack Smith, the special counsel's office, just letting the press gathered in that room know that the special counsel, Jack Smith, will come out here shortly and make, I think he said, a 2-minute statement with no questions. So we are, of course, keenly watching that side of the screen, and we'll bring you that as soon as it gets underway. But let's go back to Garrett. You were making your point.
Well, Lester, and that aide just made it for me perfectly. I mean, what we're going to see from Jack Smith is 2 minutes of prepared remarks with no questions. Donald Trump does 10 minutes on the idea that he's being a political target every time he takes the stage for a campaign event and in every interview that he does. And so in terms of kind of the information battlefield here, it's never been a fair fight. But when these when these legal cases move to the courtroom rather than from the political realm, I think that's when things change. And that's when prosecutors will have a chance to have their say. But as it's been now, it's been the former president with the enormous megaphone that he has who's been kind of defining the terms of the political debate around this, particularly on the right. And that's really what matters most to his campaign right now. Get through this Republican nomination, then deal with kind of the broader country, many of whom don't see this at all the same way as his supporters do, when that time comes.
All right, Garrett, we'll ask you to stand by. Let me go back to Laura Jarrett here at the desk with me. You've had a chance to go through more of this document. It is what they call a speaking indictment, so it
speaks volumes.
It lays it out for people like me.
It tells a story, and the story that it's, I think, trying to tell is one that if first you don't succeed, you try again. And so the first attempt by the former president, according to this, was to try to put pressure on folks down in the states, in the 7 battleground states, excuse me, to try to have the overturn the election results in those states. And as a part of that scheme, they actually signed false certifications saying that the former president had won, when in fact he had not. And they knew that those statements were false. And according to this document, this was actually done at Trump's direction. And we see the special counsel, Jack Smith, walking to the podium there now, expected to make some brief remarks, but not take any questions.
Good evening. Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with conspiring to defraud the United States, conspiring to disenfranchise voters, and conspiring and attempting to obstruct an official proceeding. The indictment was issued by a grand jury of citizens here in the District of Columbia, and it sets forth the crimes charged in detail. I encourage everyone to read it in full. The attack on our nation's capital on January 6th, 2021 was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy. As described in the indictment, It was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election. The men and women of law enforcement who defended the U.S. Capitol on January 6th are heroes. They are patriots and they are the very best of us. They did not just defend a building or the people sheltering in it. They put their lives on the line to defend who we are as a country and as a people. They defended the very institutions and principles that define the United States. Since the attack on our Capitol, the Department of Justice has remained committed to ensuring accountability for those criminally responsible for what happened that day. This case is brought consistent with that commitment, and our investigation of other individuals continues. In this case, my office will seek a speedy trial so that our evidence can be tested in court and judged by a jury of citizens. In the meantime, I must emphasize that the indictment is only an allegation and that the defendant must be presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. I would like to thank the members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation who are working on this investigation with my office, as well as the many career prosecutors and law enforcement agents from around the country who have worked on previous January 6th investigations. These women and men are public servants of the very highest order, and it is a privilege to work alongside them. Thank you.
Why didn't you charge any of the other? What does that mean in terms of real time?
A defendant always has a right to a speedy trial, and most defendants that are in custody, of course, want a speedy trial. This situation is different, with the defendant being the front runner for the Republican nomination, somebody who is trying to go back into office, and someone who does not, at least according to his legal filings, actually want these cases to proceed. Query whether it helps him politically. I leave that to others. But you hear from Special Counsel Jack Smith there reiterating that he wants a speedy trial, something that he said last time. One of the few times that he made an appearance in the classified documents case, he said that in that case he got a May trial date. Query whether he gets one that's a little bit earlier here. A lot, of course, depends on the judge. And in this case, we don't know who this is assigned to yet. We'll see who gets it in Washington, D.C. But the judge has a lot of power in terms of keeping things on track, in terms of what motions get filed. Certainly, they're going to have a lot of power here.
Danny, let me ask you this. There are people who may be watching this thinking, haven't we seen this before? Wasn't it called an impeachment trial? And then the January 6 hearings, they feel like they've seen all the evidence in this case.
Yeah, interesting that most of the public has heard all of this evidence. We heard it last year during the January 6th committee hearings. We heard it back during the impeachment trial. But one of the things that we just talked about in terms of the speedy trial, you heard Jack Smith say he's going to seek a speedy trial. Now, the Speedy Trial Act requires that trial be brought within 70 days of arraignment. It's supposed to benefit the defendant. In this case, and in the documents case, it benefits the government. Here's why. And that's why Jack Smith wants that speedy trial. It makes sense. They've been investigating this case, just like we talked about, for 2.5 years. They are locked and loaded. They are ready to go. They didn't drop this indictment until they knew it was absolutely ready, and they had all the evidence to support every paragraph in this indictment, and there are hundreds. So the government is ready to go. There are many instances in which speedy trial benefits the defendant. A good example is when somebody's arrested mid-crime and the government is playing catch-up to investigate the case at the same speed as the defense is. That is not this case. The defense has none of the discovery yet. They will not get it for weeks. And when they do, their job begins. So speedy trial in this case, although it's designed to benefit the defendant and can benefit the defendant, will benefit the government. Look for the government, just as it did in the documents case in Mar-a-Lago, to seek a speedy trial to move this case as quickly as they can. Remember, the government asked for a December trial date in the Mar-a-Lago documents case.
And just very quickly, will this be like what we saw in Miami? He'll make an appearance, enter his plea, and leave?
Exactly right. It's an arraignment. He'll show up. He'll enter a plea. It is a short event. It is procedurally very significant, but substantively in the courtroom can take 15 minutes. In state court, it can take a couple minutes. So that is exactly what we'll see, just as we saw in Mar-a-Lago. There are no co-defendants, so we're not going to have a situation where one of the co-defendants can't find a local lawyer. This will be even smoother and faster than the Mar-a-Lago arraignment.
We should also point out a speedy trial is there to protect the public. And in an indictment in which he's being accused of actually disenfranchising voters, you can see Smith's team is going to want to emphasize that.
All right. Well, that concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have much more ahead on NBC Nightly News, which will be any moment now for many of you. I'm Lester Holt. Thank you for watching.